Well, it's time to get started, so take a seat. It's the Science Cafe, brought to you by OEB.
Tonight's cafe is the last one of the semester, so it'll be a bit of a break. But when we are back for next semester on February 8th, we will have a postdoctoral fellow here talking about her work. And so that's Dara. She'll be doing a Science Cafe titled Battle of the Sexes, Exploring Arms Races in Marine Mammal Mating Strategies. So look for that February 8th when we're back on campus. All right, without further ado, I'd like to get started on tonight. So tonight we are doing flower power, and we're doing that here with Madelaine Bartlett here. And for people that haven't been to science cafes before, so the way we normally do this is we break it up into 3 different groups. So there's sort of 3 different themes that we're going through. Madelaine and I will sort of start the conversation, and then we'll pause our conversation and get audience questions, and then kind of move on to the next theme that we'd like to cover. So to start with, sort of getting to know Madelaine, sort of my first question for you is, so today clearly we're talking about flowers. I'm just sort of curious, how did you, and now here you are, foremost in your field, working on the development of flowers. How did you get to this position?
Well, I'm South African. I grew up in South Africa, and my father is a gardener, and South Africa has a lot of flowers. We are a hotspot of diversity, for plant diversity. And I just grew up around plants, but I never really thought it was something I could do for a job. I didn't know that was an option until I came to the US. I came to Berkeley to do my PhD, thinking I was going to work on genetics. So I wanted to do plant genetics, but I didn't realize how much I loved flowers. And so it was a nice mix of this thing that I really liked, which was just being around plants and looking at plants, and then to be able to do the genetics at the same time. And that's what drew me to it, is genetics plus plants. And then I managed to get a job doing it, so that's really great. Yeah.
So I'm curious, genetics is sort of you don't just wake up one morning and oh, I love genetics. That's what I wanted to tell. How did you come across? I get, so it's a little bit easier to be oh, I'm surrounded by beautiful flowers. Yeah. I want to understand them and how they work. So, but how about the genetics piece? How did that get worked in?
It was as an undergraduate. I just really loved, genetics is so logical. I always loved logic puzzles when I was a kid. And it is the most satisfying logic in the whole world. There is an answer, it is a definite answer, and you can find the answer. And it was something and you just have to use your brain. And that part of it I really liked about it. It was, and it's still the thing that I love most, is it's a logic puzzle. And it was as an undergraduate, I was in a developmental genetics class. My major was in genetics and developmental biology. And I really loved, it was actually Drosophila genetics that got me into it. And then when I found out I could do it in maize, was very appealing to me, because I just have always liked plants. And and corn or maize is a really big, strong genetic model. Yeah.
That makes sense. And what about, also, is it flipped on?
It is.
Okay, just checking. Yeah. I can hear myself better than I can hear you, so I just want to make sure. And okay, so this is kind of off of our script a little bit, personal question, but how is going through the sciences in South Africa? Is that much different than how it feels here?
Well, I think things have changed a lot, but the reason why it's changed is that access. When I grew up under apartheid, so I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and the universities in South Africa at the time were outstanding, but only available to white people, right? So because it was apartheid, and but they really are were world-class universities, and they still are world-class universities. They just are now trying to undo the evils of the past, right? Where now, instead of keeping that education only for 15% of the population, they're trying to give that education to everybody. And that's difficult, right? But they're still managing to do a really good job. And I found that I was really scared coming to, because I got into Berkeley, and I had really serious imposter syndrome. I was really sure that as soon as I got there, they were going to figure out that I didn't know what I was doing and just send me back home again. And I realized pretty quickly that my education that I got in South Africa was on a par with the education in biology that some of my American colleagues had gotten at Yale and Stanford and Berkeley. And my science education, it's very different. It's not like here where you take it's not a liberal arts education. It's you start doing science from day one and that's all you do, right? I didn't take any other classes except biology classes after my first year. And so our education in biology is very deep, and we have a lot of practical experience, and still it was an outstanding education in biology. And I think the universities are still trying to maintain that, right? They're doing the best job that they can, and it's still a really good education. Yeah.
They just suddenly have a lot more students.
They suddenly have a lot more students, right? And they're doing a pretty good job of it. It's very challenging, right? But they're doing the best they can. Yeah.
That's great. That's a really nice sort of intro of where you're coming from. There might be more questions about that, but just so we have a lot. So I was sort of laughing a little bit when you said like, oh, genetics is super logical because, you just like figure it out. Because I was thinking about when we put together what we were going to talk about. I was like, I left that conversation just like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. But so to give us the time to like really get through all of this, let's get in. So starting just sort of from the basics of what we want to talk about today. So what is a flower? Let's start with the bare bones basics here.
So a flower is actually really complicated. Flowers are complicated. It's sort of surprising because everybody knows what a flower looks like, but very few people have actually pulled the flower apart and really thought about what it is that you're looking at. And so flowers usually, they're the reproductive structures of plants. Not all plants have a group of plants called the flowering plants or the angiosperms. And so what is a flower? Well, the reason why I haven't given you a clear answer is this is something that you could argue about for a long period of time, right? But the strictest definition of a flower is it's a compressed reproductive axis of an angiosperm. What that means is that we have the female parts of the flower and the male parts of the flower, usually surrounded by sterile organs that are attractive and protective. And so what you're looking at in this picture on the left is a major genetic model that plant biologists use to understand the molecular biology of plant genetics and plant development and many aspects of plant biology, and that's called the Arabidopsis thaliana. It's a really common weed. When Linnaeus described it, actually, he described it as a weed that has little to no use, and now it has become the dominant model system in the plant world. But anyway, on the left is Arabidopsis thaliana. It makes very small flowers. That's about a 5 millimeter tall flower, and the inside are the female parts of the flower, or the carpels, and then the stamens that make the pollen, which is includes the sperm. So in every pollen grain, you have 2 sperm. And outside of that, they're non-motile in flowering plants. They don't swim, but they're haploid sperm. And then around that are the petals that are often for attracting pollinators. And then around that are the sepals, and those are usually to protect the flower when it's in bud. And in Arabidopsis, you can just see there's little hairs on the sepals, and those are protective against things like herbivores for eating this. So flowers have these 4 different rows of organs, and their purpose is for reproduction. So on the right is a male flower from corn or maize, and you can see it's really different. Although it has the same function, essentially, it looks very different, but we still have those protective organs on the outside. And then the next, there's a little label there on something called a loticule, and that's what petals look like in grasses. There are these very specialized organs that force the flower open at the time of pollination. And then internal to that are the stamens and the male part of the flower. And then many grasses will also have the female parts of the flower internal to that, just as Arabidopsis does. But in maize or corn makes separate male and female flowers. So the female parts start to develop, and then they undergo programmed cell death a little bit later in development, and so all you'll have is the male parts in the male. And then the opposite will happen in the female flowers, where the stamens, the male parts will start to develop, and then they'll just stall. They won't develop any further, and only the female parts of the flower will develop. But yeah, so it's a long answer to a not simple question. What's a flower?
I know.
Hard to say.
And why? So why do these two? I mean, you put up these two examples because they're similar but different. Why? So why does the maize flower look different than this other than the Arabidopsis? I can't say
Arabidopsis.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
When people think of flowers, because we're pollinators, right? We are attracted to the showy petals that flowers have to attract pollinators so that they can move their sperm around, essentially. But Arabidopsis, those petals are unnecessary in most grass flowers because grass flowers are not animal pollinated, they're wind pollinated. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to be attractive to pollinators in the same way. The loticules are still really important because they force that flower open and allow the pollen to be released onto the wind column. But they don't have to be showy like they have to, right? And I put these up because Arabidopsis is the dominant model for genetics and molecular biology in plants, and because I work on corn and the grasses.
And so we're talking about here, I mean, they look different, but they're similar parts, so it's something they've evolved like this over time. So can you tell us a little bit about how flowers have evolved over time?
So there are more than 250,000 species of flowering plants. That's a low end of how many separate species there are. And a large factor in that diversity is the diversity of the flower form itself. That flowers come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and the organs themselves can have lots of different functions. And plant biologists think that one of the reasons why that diversity evolved is because of relationships between plants and their pollinators. That there's been diversification of pollinators, like insect pollinators, and in parallel diversification of flowers. That there has been this co-diversification of plants and animals to get us diversity, right? And that the plants are basically trying to trick all of the animals that they can into moving their pollen around, right? Mm-hmm. In whatever way. Sometimes they offer, it's not always tricking, sometimes often there are rewards like nectar, but at the end of the day, what the plant wants is it wants its pollen moved to a different individual of its species so that they can outcross.
Is there less change or less diversity than what you see for wind-pollinated flowers than what you see for plant or insect or other animal pollinated?
So that's why the grasses actually are a very interesting family, because they offer a paradox, because that's what you would think, right? Mm-hmm. If flower diversity is because of this plant and animal interactions, right, then the grasses don't help us, right? Because the grasses actually, there's many, I'm really terrible at remembering numbers, but there's thousands of species of grasses. I can't remember exactly how many, but it's actually hyper diverse. That grasses they're the most broadly distributed family of plants in the world. You can find them on every continent except Antarctica. And they're dominant in many ecosystems, right? We think of the grasslands of Africa and the prairies of the United States, right? It's these, and I'm going to stop naming ecosystems. Anyway, grasses are everywhere. They're dominant and they're highly speciose. But the wind pollination in this case it wasn't the same thing, right? One of the reasons why we think the grasses have diversified is actually because of ecological reasons, movement into new ecological niches that they could take advantage of. But it wasn't necessarily wind pollination that drove that diversification.
Got it. Maybe, so you had pointed out when we were putting together or talking about what we would talk about, these really cool murals, let's find them, really neat murals from, that are at Smith. And sort of, we were talking about how these sort of illustrate the change, or in a way illustrate the change of plants and flowers over time. Can you walk us through these a little bit? And here, if you want to go at your own pace.
So I don't, yes, this is this really cool mural that's a series of murals that's at Smith Botanical Gardens that walks us through the history of the earth through the lens of plants. Because usually when we look at these murals that are about evolution, they're focused very much on animals. But plants have actually been really important in the history of the earth, right? And if you start a really long time ago, right, this is at the earliest stages of photosynthetic life on earth, where we have these mounds of photosynthetic cyanobacteria. And this was really important in the history of the earth because photosynthesis produces oxygen. And this changed the atmosphere of the earth, right? And started building up this oxygen levels to a fairly high, to high levels, right? And this is when plants started changing our world, right? And I think of cyanobacteria as being honorary plants. Many botanists disagree with me. They're microbes, but they photosynthesize, they get to be plants. And then my point, I don't want to really spend a lot of time on these murals, but my point here is that the plants that we are used to seeing around us, right, in current terrestrial ecosystems, it's not what used to be the dominant plant life on our Earth, right? This is the earliest, this is reconstructions of what we think were the earliest land plants, these really small, scrubby, sad little things from a fossil deposit called the Rhynie Chert. Really small, simple, not very complex plants. And over time, plants became more complex in terms of their shape and form. They started branching and exploring new ways of branching. And we started getting these forests that were dominated by gymnosperms, right? So the gymnosperms, this is really timely because it's Christmas time, right? Gymnosperms are seed plants like flowering plants are, right? But they don't make flowers. And so the world, at the time, I think it's hard for me to see, but I think there's dinosaurs on this picture, right? I can only see plants. Yeah. So these, the gymnosperms were forests, the gymnosperm forests were what was dominant, and there was a lot of gymnosperm diversity in the world before the rise of the angiosperms. And then in the Cretaceous, about 250 million years ago, there was this burst of 250 million years ago, there was this burst of diversification of the angiosperms. The flowers came onto the scene and they very quickly radiated to make many, many thousands of species, right? And took over and forced really became dominant in our lives, right? And this is, I think, so this is showing, this last panel of the mural is showing, it's a bit sad actually, it's very sad, about how humans were now in the Anthropocene and how humans are now destroying some of this diversity. But my point here is not just that we live in sad times, but that also that the flower, although we're used to seeing it all over the place, right, and we've become dependent on flowering plants, it was, in terms of the evolutionary history of the Earth, it was a fairly new invention, right?
And what about, we talked a little bit of how this sort of story plays out in temperate areas versus tropical areas. So here we are in a temperate area, and that's probably a lot different than what you grew up with in South Africa.
Yeah, well, I mean, the tropics are far more diverse, right? There's many, many more species of... what's an interesting thing about plant life in the temperate world versus the tropical world is things that families that we know of as being sort of herbaceous and small in temperate ecosystems are often really big trees in tropical ecosystems, which is something that's really interesting. The things that can survive, often tropical trees can't survive in temperate regions where they can't go into a dormant phase. And so to be able to survive in a place like this, you have to be able to go dormant.
which is why we don't see palm trees in Massachusetts, right? Because they can't go dormant, and so they don't make it through the winter. And so these big tropical trees, like the bean family, right? When we think of beans, we think of green beans, right? But the legume family, and we know some tree legumes, but it's actually incredibly diverse in the tropics. And the other thing that's much more diverse in the tropics as well is gymnosperms. There are, especially where I'm from in South Africa, there's just many, many species of gymnosperms that we don't see around here. We're used to seeing these stands of pine trees and things like that, but there's actually a lot of diversity that we don't see in temperate regions.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, so maybe we'll open it up to audience questions. So just anything about Madelaine's history and sort of the basics of what a flower is and how they've changed over time. Any burning questions?
When did the angiosperms arise, approximately how many years ago?
So the diversification happened at the time of the Cretaceous. And the number, I'm on the spot now, and I'm terrible at remembering numbers. The number that's in my head is 250 million years ago, but I think that might be wrong. Don't hold me to that, right? So they must have been around before then. So the diversification of the angiosperms was something that Charles Darwin, in one of his letters to a friend, described as an abominable mystery, because they just burst onto the scene. There wasn't this slow trickle of gradual diversification. It was like suddenly there was no evidence in the fossil record, and then suddenly there were just so many different forms in the fossil record. And how that happened as fast as it did was something that people are still talking about how the angiosperms managed to do that. And depending on, I think about flowers, and so I favor the explanation that this was this diversification of plants and animals together. But it was, in terms of the fossil record, it wasn't in the Jurassic, well beyond the Jurassic. Yeah. Yes.
Was there a parallel diversification of the animal kingdom in some way?
And that's
certain kinds that might have been interacting. That did the plants spur the animals, or the animals somehow diversify and spur the plants to take advantage? So
plants tend to be. So there have been a number of co-diversification events. And and particularly with insects, right? Insects are often the things that most flowering plants are insect pollinated, and there's lots of specialization for particular kinds of insects and things like that. In some families, the plants lead, and in other families, the insects lead. It just depends on what you're looking at as to who's leading the diversification.
Do you look at who has the earlier fossil record? How do you know back there which was leading?
So nowadays what people do is you can use techniques, it's a field of biology called phylogenetics, right? And you can, when you have fossils that you can date, and you have a tree that you've built using DNA sequence, right? You can calibrate that tree with fossils that have a known date from carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. And then you can compare the two different trees and see with, big margins of error, because this is very imprecise, which came first, right? Yeah. Yes.
Was there human population at that point, or
No.
even,
No, this is long before humans.
dinosaurs?
After the dinosaurs, before the humans, right?
Okay.
So this is long after the age of the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't see flowers.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right on. No, I see that.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about relating to the trees and the difference between conifers and flowering plants, in that they have different wood, that they have vessel elements in angiosperms, which allows them to be more efficient in water use when there's lots of water, but when there's not a lot of water, then the conifers kind of win out. And I wondered how that arose, that type of vessel element in the xylem, if that arose at the same time that the flower and the fruit, and how that gave them an advantage, and how that played out in the distribution we see now.
So the sister to all other angiosperms is a plant called Amberella, and Amberella doesn't have those vessel elements. And then after that, the vessel elements. So Amberella has very small, very ugly, very simple flowers. And then after the divergence of the rest of the lineage that would then radiate into the rest of the angiosperms, there we see the emergence of those vessel elements. So the flower came first, the vessel elements came after that, right? I am not a plant physiologist, so I don't know a lot about vessels and water use efficiency in terms of anatomy. But one interesting thing about gymnosperm versus angiosperm, so I've been using these words that we call, they're all seed plants. Angiosperms are the flowering plants, and gymnosperms are the conifers. There are other gymnosperms that are not conifers, but that's the sister to all flowering plants. And the interesting thing is, as though we always use these words, the words are actually wrong. The gymnosperm means naked seed, and angiosperm means enclosed seed, and that's actually it doesn't work. There are gymnosperms that have enclosed seeds, right? And so it's a really confusing because the word is wrong. It should be gymno-ovulate versus angio-ovulate, because it's actually at the time of pollination. The one thing that separates gymnosperms from angiosperms is not actually the flower. This is why it's really, to ask what is the flower, it's actually really complicated. There are some gymnosperms that have cones or reproductive axes that resemble flowers very closely. And I mean, they're very close to being flowers, right? But the thing that separates the gymnosperms from the angiosperms is that at the time of pollination, the ovule in gymnosperms is open to the atmosphere. And at the time of pollination, the ovule of angiosperms is enclosed within a carpel. That's really the only thing, like the one character we can find to separate them. And you can actually see it at the time, in the spring. I don't know if anybody has noticed around here, you'll see these little glistening drops on pine cones and on, that's called the pollination drop. And that's this really cool liquid that gymnosperms produce that is produced by the breakdown of cells around the ovule that is pushed up through this little tube through capillary action, and then pollen lands on that, gymnosperm pollen lands on that, and then that pollination drop is withdrawn back to where the ovule is, right? And that's how pollination works in gymnosperms, through this pollination drop that's exuded and then pulled back in. And the ovule is at the base of this little tube and it's open to the atmosphere. Whereas in angiosperms, that's not the case. In most angiosperms, the ovule is really tightly enclosed in this specialized female structure called the carpel, right? And many people, including myself, think that that's the key thing that makes a flower, is that this very specialized carpel. Anyway, botanical fun facts. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe this would be a good point then to sort of transition from, so we've talked a lot about what a flower looks like and all the diversity we see and the diversity of that through time. Maybe we should start getting to, so how does this all actually develop? So let's start getting into the genetics.
So maybe, I think this is something where it's best to have a slide, right? No, these are cool flowers. Oh, I do want to tell you about this.
We can, I know, okay. I'm sort of skipping ahead because we have so much to cover, but
go for it. This is really cool. I went and found these pictures. This is this really cool thing that flowers do, is this mimicry, where on the left are these two orchids that resemble insects, right? And so this is a way of tricking insects into coming and copulating with these orchids, right? Because they will also produce pheromones that attract their pollinators. This very specialized one plant, one insect plant pollinator relationship. And then on the right is a plant from South Africa called Stapelia, which is actually about to bloom in the Marl greenhouses at UMass, so you should come and look at it. It makes beautiful flowers, but they stink. They smell like rotting meat, and that's why you can see there's a fly on there. They're pollinated by flies. So they trick the flies into thinking that they're going to get some delicious rotten meat to eat, but they don't. And so the flies will just come there, get pollen on them, and then move to the next one. So anyway, let's talk about genetics. Okay, so this is a picture I always put up because this is the thing that plants amaze me, genetics amazes me, but this is also something that I just find to be fascinating.
the process of development, that you can go from a single-celled zygote, a single-celled embryo, right, all the way up to a really complex multicellular organism. And I've always been interested in the genes that do that, right? How do the molecules that are encoded in our DNA, right, how do they work to build an organism, right? And so this is what this slide is showing is this really, it's been this really important model of floral genetics that was developed in Arabidopsis and snapdragons, actually, that describes how these 4 sets of genes specify whether an organ is going to be a sepal or a petal or a stamen or a carpel, right? And so these 4 sets of genes are very closely related to one another, right? So we call this the ABCE model of flower development. These are all genes that encode proteins that turn other genes on and off, right? So these guys are master regulators at the top of a developmental process, right? They are like the CEOs that decide, okay, all of you have to go and do this job, right? Go build this ship, right? And they're the ones, the decision makers at the top of these cascades. And depending on how they are combined, right? If you only have A class plus E class genes, then you will develop into a sepal, right? If you're an organ that has A plus E class genes being expressed in you, you'll develop into a sepal. A plus B plus E class genes, and you'll be a petal. And B plus C plus E, you'll be a stamen. And C plus E, you'll be a carpel, right? And so that's what all of these pictures are showing here. Depending on which versions of these genes you express, that will determine whether you're going to develop, what kind of organ you're going to develop into in a flower. What's really exciting about this model is that, so not all flowers look like Arabidopsis, right? You can see all of this. This is a tiny little fraction of the diversity, floral diversity that's in the world. Not all flowers look like Arabidopsis, but they're all built from the same parts. And we've already discussed this a little bit. That's, although they look really different, all of these flowers have stamens, for example. And that's what I'm highlighting here in red, are the stamens in each one of these kinds of flowers. So they don't look like stamens. They look very different from one another, but they're all stamens. And it's the same with the petals. So these look very different from one another, but in all of these cases, and I'll just go backwards and forwards so you can see stamens and petals. So even though they look very different and they function very differently, they're all the same homologous organs. And what's really cool about this ABCE model that I was talking about, how you can mix and match these classes of genes and get different kinds of organs, is that it's not just true in Arabidopsis that these genes specify petal or stamen development. It's actually true across every flowering plant actually that's been studied in terms of looking at these genes, right? That the same genes, even when petals and stamens look really different from one another, their development is controlled by the same genes. And so this, just to illustrate this is, so in Arabidopsis, we get these genetic mutants when these B class genes are knocked out. These Arabidopsis flowers no longer make petals and stamens. That tells us, when we look at this mutant, that tells us that the gene has been mutated, must control petal and stamen development, right? So that same gene in maize, when we knock that gene out, we no longer get the lodicules, and that's what the petals are in grass flowers, and we no longer get stamens, right? So the same gene controls the development of the same homologous organs, even though the organs look really different from one another. And maize and Arabidopsis are pretty much as far apart from one another as you can get within the flowering plants, from A to Z, right? This node in this tree goes back about at least 125 million years, right? And which for the plant world is really old. So this is a thing that to me is really interesting, right? That we can get the same genes, but the organs look really different. And so that's something that I'm trying to study using the grasses, is how this actually works. What these genes are doing, that even though what these genes are doing to make these organs look really different from one another. Why does a stamen in maize not look like a stamen in Arabidopsis? Is one of the questions that at the big scale I'm trying to answer, right? What are the genes downstream of these big master regulators that have changed over the course of evolution?
So if you look back, so right here we're looking at what flowers look like now.
Yes.
If you follow that back to the common ancestor, what do you think of that sort of one of those early common ancestors of a flower looked like?
So people have done this a lot, right? This is something that people have spent a lot of time going, both like trying to reconstruct ancestral states going from extant flowers and then also looking at fossils to try and understand it. And the oldest flowers we actually know quite a lot about them. They were probably bisexual. They probably made both stamens and carpels. They both had female and male parts. They probably had petals. Those petals, unlike in Arabidopsis and maize though, is there a floral? Let's go back. Oh yeah, you can see here. This is what's called a floral diagram, and you can see this is the sepals on the outside, and then the petals, then the stamens, and then the carpels, and how all of those organs are arranged in concentric circles around the central point, right? Those are called floral whorls of organs. So in Arabidopsis and maize, this is the case, where they're arranged in circles. But the earliest flowers probably had their floral parts arranged in spirals from the outside to the inside. And instead of having this very strict definition between sepals to petals to stamens to carpels, in between there was some more sort of fuzziness between those organs, where the sepals would sort of spiral into things that were half sepal, half petal, mixed identity, and then there would be half petal, half stamen identity spiraling in towards the center of the flower. Something that a flower that actually still looks like, in some ways, like what those oldest flowers probably look like are magnolias, some magnolia flowers. Even though magnolias are not the oldest lineage of flowering plants, they represent, their flowers we think are still close to what those oldest flowers might have looked like.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Like, is there anything that like looks
Yes.
like that?
Yeah. So magnolias, and I just want to reiterate, magnolias are not as ancient as some of the other lineages that are still alive today, right? But their flowers, we think, have maintained some of those ancient traits.
What's a really ancient lineage?
It's this really sad thing, Amberella. It's lives
right,
in,
you were talking
yeah.
about that.
It's really not a charismatic plant.
You don't have pictures of it, do you? Because I have no idea. Like, no idea what it is.
There's
not much to look at.
There's not much to look at. Anytime the flowers are tiny, they're probably well, they're not as small as grass flowers. They're probably 1 centimeter across, and they're really ugly. They look like an inexpert potter has made a really rustic, heartfelt flower, right? That's what it reminds me of. He's not that good at making flowers yet.
Well, they seem like they're doing okay if they're the
Not
most
really.
ancient.
They're nearing extinction.
Even sadder.
There's one species in the entire. It's this on this really long branch there at the base of the tree. This one species. It's
Where do they?
Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of wondering, sort of put this into, we've been talking, I mean, you've been sort of talking about how you're just sort of fascinated by what it is, but you also have been doing a lot of work in corn and maize flowers, and so I'm sort of wondering, putting together sort of your basic science stuff, so basic science being just sort of understanding the underlying science for this sort of the sake of understanding it. Sort of connecting that now a little bit more concrete to the applied aspect of what you do. So I'm curious, just sort of for you, your approach. Like, do you really do more of the basic science and that's what you're all about? Or are you kind of more in how it applies? Or
So I'm very much about the basic side of things, right? I have a slide a little later. We have to zoom through all these slides. Yeah, it's not that much further along. So this is a slide that shows you.
yeah, sorry, that's hard to read.
It's really hard to read. But basically, these are the crops that provide most of the calories of people in our diets, right? And 3 out of those 4 are grasses, right? And so the calories that we get from grasses and from corn and rice and wheat, and even if you don't eat a lot of corn, if you eat any meat in the United States, you're like a tucker chip with legs, right? Because in the United States, we feed our cattle and our chickens and everything corn, right? And the carbon that we get from those cows was fixed through a corn plant, right? It was fixed through photosynthesis in a corn plant. And so we're really dependent on grasses for our survival. Populations are growing, and we're facing climate change, and we don't really understand some of the basics of how these grass flowers develop. And I find that to be pretty unsettling, right? There's so because we eat grain, right? Grain is fruit. So when we eat any cereal crop, a grain of rice or a kernel of corn or flour, we're eating fruits. And those fruits came through flower development, right? The end product of flower development and the point of flower development is to make a seed. And we don't really understand exactly how those flowers are built. And so I still feel like there is so much in plant development that is mysterious, that we don't know, that although there are people that are doing what we do know, they're doing excellent work applying it, right? I still feel like I don't need to move on to the applied side quite yet, because there's still so much we don't really understand, right? Yeah, I don't like that we're dependent on something that we don't quite get. And I mean, and the long game is once you understand flower development, you can manipulate it, right? Because one of the reasons why corn in the United States why corn breeding programs have been so successful in the United States is because it's really, really, really easy to cross corn. Corn is super easy to take two very different plants, cross them together, and get a hybrid that's far more productive than either one of those individuals. One thing that's been really powerful in maize breeding programs in the United States, and this is since the 50s, where it really started taking off, is being able to make these wide crosses. And unlike wheat and rice are both very difficult to cross, but corn is not, right? And that's because corn has separate male and female flowers. So you can decide which pollen you want to take and put onto those female flowers, right? And vice versa. So I am not a breeder, but breeders make decisions to cross corn and do it really easily and really quickly. And that's much more challenging in wheat and rice. And so to understand how those flowers develop is something that we could hope to maybe manipulate in other grass crops later, right? Yeah.
That makes sense. I think this is another great time to get other audience questions about this segment, if we have any. Just a little bit more about evolution of plants and
The not so great flower that's ancient, is that known for being eaten at all?
No. It's really, it's what's called a relict. It's just really just this sort of leftover. It's not, it's not something that's ever been used for any economic reason. Yeah, it's persisted in these, yeah.
It's in New Guinea though?
Yeah, Papua New Guinea is where I think it's endemic too, yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, yes. Hopefully I'm not wrong. It's somewhere around there.
Would it be helpful to talk about some of the other basal groups, the Anita group, like the Elysium people might know star anise?
Yes, and those are not, but that's Amberella, and then after that is the Nymphaeales. So Amberella is the earliest lineage, there's really nothing else in there. Then there's the Nymphaeales, that's the water lilies, are the things that you know. There's some really cool in the pond, that's Akmart Holyoke. There's some Kabamba in there that blooms. That's in the Nymphaeales. It's an early diverging lineage. And then, and then after that is things like star anise and which in its trees is what we see after that. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any connection between flowering groups and those plants that develop carnivory?
So there are no carnivorous gymnosperms, right? The carnivorous plants, there are a number of lineages of carnivorous plants, and they're all flowering plants. But I don't think that's necessarily because they have flowers. I think there's just more to work with. There's so many species of
flowering plants, that's where they happen to pop up, right? It's usually associated with low nitrogen. Under low nitrogen pressure, the plants have to figure out a different way to get nitrogen, and so they eat insects,
So
basically.
you think it's the diversity of the angiosperms, not the length of time the gymnosperms have been? They've been around a lot longer.
Well, maybe there's some part of flowering plant
plasticity.
physiology that allows them to do it. I would just be speculating even more than I have been already. I would there are no carnivorous gymnosperms. All carnivorous plants are angiosperms, are flowering plants.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's a little bit off, but it's you were talking about corn, and I absolutely love it. Do you have any idea why it's become or has been the dominant grain in the U.S.? Is that
Do you
just
mean
because-
in modern history,
Yeah,
or why
modern
was it
history, no,
domesticated?
modern history. Is that because it was here, or?
So there was a lot of money put into it, right? The breeding programs for corn were really well supported, and it is the easiest thing to make wine crosses with it, right? It really is, and there's a lot of genetic diversity in corn that there isn't in some other grass crops, right? There's a lot of material there to work with in the first place, right? And I have been in talks where people have explained this, and I honestly can't remember, so I would be, yeah, there are some of the reasons why corn became dominant were political. Some of them were because of the nature of corn itself, biological, whether it's that genetic diversity, and also the flower morphology has been really important, inflorescence morphology in general, for breeding programs. So just to explain what I mean by genetic diversity, right? So if you look at two different lines of corn, they will even though to people that aren't used to working with corn, superficially they'll look really similar. But if you sequence their genomes, they'll be more different from one another than humans are from chimps, right? There is far more diversity within that single species that we call corn than there is in the whole of Homo sapiens plus Pan, right? Pan troglodytes. Like chimps and humans are more similar to each other than two different kinds of corn. In some cases, yes.
In that context, would you explain GMOs?
Oh, that's,
So-
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a perfect transition
Yes.
to what we have as our...
I think we have a scary. So I think this is something. Before we get into the scariness of GMOs, right? These words that are being bandied about. I think this is an important quote. It is a little bit of an overblown quote. I go backwards and forwards between thinking that it's a great quote and thinking like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. This is by a very famous. This is Elliot Meyerowitz. He's actually the person who was instrumental in coming up with that ABC model I was talking to you about. But that this for human welfare is the most important object on Earth. What this object is this is actually a cluster of stem cells that's at the tip of a growing plant called the shoot apical meristem that produces all of the leaves that a plant is going to produce, right? And so this is really fundamentally different to what animal development is like, where we produce our organs once. And there are rare exceptions where animals will continue to produce their organs the whole way through their life. Plants are really different, right? They're always producing leaves or flowers or whatever it is. And the reason why this is the most important object on Earth is because our calories are dependent on, we get our calories from this, right? This cluster of stem cells produces the leaves, produces the flowers, produces the fruit that we need to survive, right? So in that context, right, because humans are dependent on plant development for survival, right, we've always been changing it and modifying it, right? Modern agriculture is on the basis of these plants that are really different from what they came on through the process of domestication. So this is an ear of corn. This is what you're used to looking at, right? This is what its wild progenitor looks like. You can cross these two. You will. These are perfectly interfertile. These are not two different species. They're just two different cultivars, essentially, of the same species. This is called teosinte. This is an ear of teosinte, and this is an ear of corn.
And this process of changing the ear of teosinte into this sort of monstrous ear of corn is a process of breeding and mutations arising, and us, and I mean ancient agronomists, selecting things that were more productive over the history of time, right? Similarly, this is what the wild progenitors of tomatoes look like, right? Well, this is a wild relative of tomato. This is likely what their wild progenitors look like, and these are the tomatoes you see in the grocery store, right? So this process of domestication, of changing plants from what their wild progenitors looked like, right? Something humans have been doing for a very long time, right? And because of this change, right, that's happened over time, I sort of view genetic modification as this very next step, right? It's not something that frightens me, right? Because we're not eating anything natural anyway. Our agricultural systems are dependent on things that have been made through domestication and breeding programs, right? And that our civilization depends on, right? Because we're not hunters and gatherers anymore. You know, we need farmers, and we need food, and we need productive food. And genetic modification is a technology that allows us to accelerate this process. So it doesn't need to take many hundreds of years to get from this to this. We can, in a directed way, decide what's going to work best. Like, for example, like the papayas in Hawaii was one of the best examples of this, right? Where the papayas were going to be wiped out because of this virus that was moving through all of the papaya plantations in Hawaii. And there was a single virus that was moving through these plantations, and what geneticists could do was to move a gene that conferred resistance to that virus into all of those papayas, and it saved the papaya industry in Hawaii, right? There are so many examples of places where there can be this really positive impact of genetic modification, right? That's, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of genes in the genome, right? Already, there's so many genes in those genomes already, right? And this modification of single genes, or the addition of single genes that can confer traits that give us an advantage, I see as something hopeful, right? When we're facing all of these challenges coming down the pipe, right? Too many humans and climate change, right? I'm grateful that humans have one more tool in their toolbox, right? But like every technology, and I mean, GMO, I'm not talking here about the nitty-gritty of how we do genetic modification, and I can give you details about that if that's what you'd like to know, right? But it's high tech, right? It's not simple. You can't do it in your backyard, right? You need
transferring pollen.
Yes. You need a lab to do it, right? And you need training as a geneticist and in DNA and how that works in order to understand it, right? And like any new technology, it's not uniformly good, right? Just as like any technology that we accept into our lives has pros and cons, like cell phones, like the ever-presence of Google in our lives, right? How Google knows everything about me, and I'm fine with that because I have a terrible sense of direction, and it allows me to get from one place to another. It's like Google is like, would you like to go home now? Yes, I would. Google knows where I live, right? And I'm fine with that. But and because it makes my life easier, right? But there are definite cons to this. And now Google knows about me because I'm going to be on film and I'm going to be on YouTube, right? We accept this technology into our lives without thinking about the pros and cons when it comes to some technologies. But for some reason with GMOs, people are a lot more frightened about it. And it's really hard for me to, because I've been a biologist, I went into, as an undergrad, as I said, I was just doing biology from when I was 18, right? I have been absorbing this from when I was a kid, and so I never really, it's hard for me to engage what's frightening about it, right? And I'm not saying that all technology is good, we should do it all without being thoughtful about what it is that we're doing, right? But for me, it's something that, looking forward, it's one of the things that makes me feel
that maybe we're going to be okay, you know, because we have options. And it's not just GMO. GMO is also not a silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, right? We need to be conscious about breeding programs for places like that the Green Revolution failed in Africa, right? So that we can start thinking about how we're going to get good crops for the continent of Africa, right? We have to try everything that we can so that, yeah, for our good as humans is sort of how I feel about it, yes.
I think with GMO, I think of you know, the chemical companies that, you know, trademark and copyright their particular genetic material, and then, you know, you've got to use their herbicides because.
But I sort of think I hear what you're saying, right? That I think that's a separate issue. I think that's not GMO that's frightening. What there is frightening is to have all of this intellectual property in the hands of corporations instead of governments, right?
Monsanto or something.
Yeah, right. And I don't see. I mean, Monsanto and Pioneer and these giant seed companies have just stepped into a void, right? Because as federal funding has dried up for basic research, right, they have been, that's who's been doing it, right? I think that having intellectual property that is to do with our food in the hands of private corporations is problematic. That's what I think is a problem, right? I think that we should, as Americans, as citizens of the world, we should be fighting hard that this is all in the public domain, right? But what do we see? Every year, USDA funding gets cut even more. NSF funding gets cut even more, right? And so I sort of think that it's problematic to have intellectual property in the hands of corporations, right? But that's not the technology that's at fault. That's the lack of support for public science, right? And scientists have also been at fault. We haven't been very good at explaining that. And even now I can feel myself not being very good at explaining it, because for me, it's really hard for me to connect with the problem with the actual technology, you know? And even the thing, the herbicide resistance that has become really dominant in across the world. It's this thing where you have to, you Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready cotton is the other one that it is, right? That has actually reduced herbicide use in many cases, right? Even there where it is a private corporation that's selling seed and then selling this herbicide, it's actually, in some cases, it's been good because farmers are no longer spraying as much herbicide as they were before, right? And then if you have a different conversation of like, well, we shouldn't be spraying herbicide at all, that's different to, that's organic versus not, right? There was herbicide being sprayed. It was being sprayed in vast amounts. It was leaching into our water tables, and the existence of this Roundup Ready corn reduced the amount of herbicide that was being sprayed. There are other problems, right? But it's not uniformly bad and it's not uniformly good, in my mind. We live in a complex world with facing a lot of challenges. And yeah, I'd like us to be able to try all of it. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
I think we have time. I mean, there's a lot to cover here. We have time for one more question, and then I think, Madelaine, are you able to stay a few minutes after?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's so much more to talk about. Like we hardly got through what we were planning to talk about. So maybe if there's one more question, and then we'll wrap up for the evening.
Yes.
Paul, yeah.
Sure. So why do some flowers have male parts and female parts? Some have female only parts, some male. Sometimes the male and female parts are on different plants. What's going on?
Another excellent question that scientists have been trying to answer for a very long time, right? So flowers are very complex, and you have male function and female function trying to be optimized all at the same time. And sometimes it's better if you can optimize those two different functions separately, right? But the problem is that you need someone nearby you that's going to be male or female, right? And so it's a risk to not be able to self, right? To not be able to make your own seed on your own plant, right? Is sometimes can be a risk, right? And so it's this trade-off, complicated trade-off between optimizing male versus female function and also being able to self, right? And also if you're animal pollinated, you often need the two parts close to one another, right? Because if you're tricking if you're luring a bee to you, right, with your pollen, for example, right, or your nectar, right, you want the bee to come and visit that flower, get your pollen, and bring you pollen from another flower at the same time, right? And so sometimes it's advantageous to have both together if you're animal pollinated, but it does lead to this complexity of having two separate functions. So separate male and female flowers is actually much more common in wind pollinated plants than in animal pollinated plants, because they can separate and optimize each of those functions separately. There's also another interesting correlation that we don't, and I mean we as scientists don't completely understand, between resources and whether you're going to have separate male and female flowers. So in low resource environments, it's more common for separate male and female flowers to emerge. It's also more common to have separate male and female plants if you're polyploid, which is also something that I don't really understand. And there are ideas for why that may be, but it's still really mysterious. Lots of people are trying to work on it. Everybody has their favorite hypothesis. For me, because I think about flowers, it's about male versus female and doing it both to the best of your abilities.
All right, well, I think we're gonna wrap it up there, but like I said, if there's any other questions about any of these basic science questions or the GMOs or Madelaine's history, any of the lingering questions, she'll be around after. And if we could just, I'll give her a round of applause.